for as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with planes. My entire kind of ambition was always to become an airline pilot. I then found out that actually my eyesight, because I was short-sighted, potentially, because it hadn't yet settled, would have meant that I potentially would have failed the Class 1 medical that you need. And I said, I don't know what to write. And she goes, well, why don't you just be really honest? Just say, I don't have any experience, but how will one ever gain experience if you're not given the chance? If you are really passionate about something that you are doing, and you're willing and eager and curious to learn, then I think those are the ingredients for success. We left Bosnia and came to London as refugees. Being outsiders in the UK, we got a lot of help, and I think there's something magical about it. Like at the end of the day, you look out the window at sort of 35,000 feet, and you're thinking, how? I was curious, and I wanted to learn.
Ben, people don't do this.
This is not normal.
I remember speaking to one of the CEOs at BA, who, when I asked him, what it's like being a CEO, he goes, what you need to remember with something like BA is
Welcome everyone back to the Flying High Club. It's lovely to have you back. Thank you for viewing, subscribing and listening. We're having such an amazing response. I love the LinkedIn messages, the shares, even the previous videos are doing so well. Keep that support up. And today we have a really, really interesting episode. It's one that we talk about of what do we focus on when we're going forward with the youth of tomorrow, and who are the inspiring stories that have broken glass ceilings and broken barriers. And we'll cover that just a little, but there is someone joining me again today who has disappeared for a couple of episodes. My guest, a co-host, is back. Sahel, welcome back.
Thank you, Reza.
It's about time.
It is. I think we've had a good time in the background. I'm now obviously spending more time in the Middle East, so being present in here has been difficult, but we're now trying to spend a bit more time. I think we've had some good feedback when the two of us have been doing it. I also need to keep an eye on Reza sometimes as well. But listen, it's allowed us to build a platform where hopefully we're looking to go a bit more global with this. So again, that's only going to come through your support. So we really need you to keep that support going. And actually progress is being made. We're bringing in some really, really great guests. We've signed our first commercial sponsorship, which is really good. That will help us expand the podcast as well. And like I said, there's a lot of exciting things to come over the next few months, and we've got some really, really good, exciting announcements.
Some big announcements coming.
Yeah, which we're not quite allowed to share just yet, but they will come. So we're not just teasing; we will deliver on those. But today, I'm really privileged actually to be welcomed back for this episode. For someone actually, we'll get into, but I looked at first thinking, where did this guy come from? And actually then watching...
Funny, I had the same thought.
and actually then, seeing that meteoric rise and actually the impact, that's the key thing here. Everyone can see people do well in career, but actually seeing people make an impact. So we're going to hopefully delve into that today with you.
Well, I think that's the perfect intro to bring on our guest, he's the youngest C-level to ever grace the boardroom of British Airways, one of the largest brands, UK brands in the world and global brands. And he's broke the glass ceilings, like I mentioned, and had this meteoric rise up to the sea level. And he's none other than our good friend and colleague, ex-colleague as well. It's Ben Sehovic, everyone.
Thank you, Rosa, Sahel.
Thank you for coming on. It's really, really good to have you. How are you keeping?
Very well, thanks. Yeah, really enjoying myself. It's been lovely to be here as well. But I have spent the last 7-8 months trying to create my new startup. So I've been exploring sort of outside of large corporate world.
Amazing. Well, Ben, we're gonna dive into that. But one key thing that I want to really know is this meteoric rise that this brand did. We did discuss literally. We have all somehow, some weird way, worked together or work on different projects in the companies that we've worked with. So what I really want to start on is how you got into aviation, your sort of upbringing, because there's a really interesting story there, and one that I think would resonate with a lot of people and inspire a bunch of people. So if you can talk us through that, that'd be amazing.
Yeah, sure. So to be honest, I'm not entirely sure how I first fell in love with aviation because the truth is it was from an incredibly young age. So for as long as I can remember, I've been obsessed with planes in one form or another. In fact, I think one of my first memories is flying from London to Kuala Lumpur in the 90s when I was little to visit my dad who worked abroad, and I was invited to the flight deck and went in, and the crew, who were marvelous, on a 747 just sort of saw this kid with beaming eyes and started talking through all the instruments, and I think just even more solidified kind of my obsession with it. So I think it started from as long as I can remember, and perhaps part of it was traveling when I was younger to go visit my dad. Perhaps it's the joy of just seeing different places. So I can't exactly pinpoint, but it really did go quite deep into my childhood because throughout my entire kind of ambition was always to become an airline pilot. So I spent all of my teenage years and at school kind of obsessing and thinking, how am I going to qualify to become an airline pilot? I sort of always would spend my evenings and weekends on Microsoft Flight Simulator. I have to say, the technology these days, compared to what we used to have for flight simulators, like I watch my nephew playing on Roblox and like on iPhone apps in better quality than the first version of Flight Simulator I had in 2000. But anyway, so I would spend a disproportionate amount of time flying those. And towards the end of my school, and I'd spent all of my choices picking subjects that I thought would be useful to become a pilot, including geography, for example, thinking that somehow on a plane there's a map when there isn't, right? It's just waypoints. And when I finished my A levels and it was time to sort of start applying to universities, I had in my head said I'm going to go and just do pilot training. And I then found out that actually my eyesight, because I was short-sighted, potentially, because I hadn't yet settled, would have meant that I potentially would have failed the Class 1 medical that you need to become a pilot. So my school said, well, why don't you study something? Go to university, see kind of what happens, and then you can kind of always go and become a pilot after that. So I said, okay, that's not a bad idea. What do you recommend? And they said, well, what are you interested in? I said, well, I'm interested in planes. So they said, well, why don't you study engineering? So I said, okay, let's do engineering. And so I went off to Cambridge, did the engineering degree there, spent 4 years, amazing experience. And when I finished that degree, I then thought, well, I've always wanted to work for an airline, and British Airways was the biggest brand that I grew up with. And so I applied to the BA Finance Graduate Scheme. That was one of the jobs I applied for. And I also was considering staying in academia and doing a PhD and carrying on with research because I did really enjoy that aspect as well. But when BA offered me the role on the finance grad scheme, and I chose finance for a really interesting reason because a lot of my friends were going into sort of banking or consulting, and I was kind of thinking this finance thing sounds quite important, so I better apply for finance. It's somehow thinking it's the same.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. I thought, you said going down the engineering route, and the first role you want to go down is
it's
finance.
Quite common, actually. You always hear investment banking. I'm going to investment banking. I'm going to this. It sort of puts you to, I'm going into aviation. Is there a balanced metric, or is it the same thing kind of thing?
Well, my logic was, so I really enjoyed the engineering degree, but one of the challenges with engineering is that you can become an absolute world expert on kind of a very sort of, not niche, but a particular part, let's say, of an aircraft. So you could be doing the wings or something like that. And I'd always kind of been attracted to sort of the macro picture and sort of the strategic side as well. So I sort of said, well, if I could balance my love for aviation alongside this sort of finance that everyone seems to be talking about, well, why don't I do finance at BA? And that's kind of what got me there. I mean, I was probably a little bit naive because I think I probably assumed that somehow banking and finance and BA were somehow linked, but obviously they're very different fields of finance. So I kind of went in completely new, right? I had no accounting experience, I had no sort of finance experience, but you kind of you teach yourself. So that's how I ended up in BA to start with.
So that's really interesting because for me, I'm going to pull out a few items there. Where when you're talking, the fact that actually walking in to British Airways, as you said, not knowing how finance works, but you learn it. You say that very candidly, but I know a lot of our viewers, when they're looking at careers, and their first steps. It's like, and I know certainly I used to think, I can't do that job because I don't know it. I don't know it. And that seems to be actually a theme, right? And I think I can testament to that. And I know, you're saying that here is actually sometimes you just got to go and do. You will go and learn. You've got to make that opportunity happen.
So I think that's spot on. And I think I learned that lesson from a young age. When I was at school, one of my hobbies was doing theatre production. So mainly sort of behind the scenes lighting, set, tech, sound, etc. And I remember going, and I was a stagehand when I was really young in one of the school shows. And I just was looking at the sort of lighting box that was sitting at the top and watching this person in there just sort of pressing these buttons and like controlling this like entire rig of lights. And I was like, I want to do that. And so I was young, right? So they sort of didn't really sort of think that this is doesn't really know what he's doing.
Yeah.
And so I remember speaking to one of my drama teachers saying, I really want to apply for this, but it has a box here saying, like, what is your experience in this? And I said, like, I don't know what to write. And she goes, well, why don't you just be really honest? Just say, I don't have any experience, but how will one ever gain experience if you're not given the chance? And I think that was kind of like a wake-up call. I was like, yeah, that's actually spot on. So that's when I then started saying, look, this is my interest, this is what I really care about, this is what I'm passionate about, and I'm willing to learn. And I think that is something that is probably the most important aspect for this. And I know there's a lot of talk now in interviews and job selection about people's potential more than experience. And I think that's probably what needs to come across more than anything. If you are really passionate about something that you are doing and you're willing and eager and curious to learn, then I think those are the ingredients for success, because that's what you actually need more than anything else. And that, I think, was something I've kind of always carried with me. If you really are interested in something and you have that passion and curiosity, you will spend hours and hours and hours just chasing and analysing and investigating and rooting out exactly what it is that you need to know to succeed. And I think that was kind of where I had this link of loving aviation. Finance may have been new, but I was willing to learn it because it was in the very topic that I was passionate about. And that's kind of what drove me.
Yeah. And again, you've just kind of summarized that really well in a really insightful way about, being curious, being passionate, and showing that potential. Because, a CV is great, but it doesn't shout those things to you. It doesn't shout that to the recruiter. So certainly being able to demonstrate that when you're in front of a prospective, recruiter or what have you, is quite key. I guess the second one that pulled out to me is that you glossed over that passion for flying with which I think a lot of people could see as a very big setback. As I've been looking forward to doing this, and all of a sudden the fact that I might not pass my medical exam for a lot of people could be a massive setback. And what comes across in this conversation here is from day one, and I think that leads us, where we start getting to in terms of where you've got to is you've taken always quite a mature and strategic view maybe on life and career without actually knowing it there. Because as you said, the minute you said about engineering, and actually that's one element, I want to learn the broader piece. The fact that actually you haven't let the passion that you had for flying set you back either. And obviously we're here today as well. So that I think is quite remarkable in itself, and from quite a young age it seems.
Yeah, I think part of any career, and part of life in general, is how you kind of deal with setbacks. I mean, the irony is that actually after I finished school, they actually changed the Class 1 regulation, so I actually would now be able to pass the medical.
Yeah, and I was going to say that, but pilots do wear glasses. Yeah.
No, they had this rule, which was, I think it was up to -5. You couldn't be below -5, and I was just on the border, and now I think it's -6. So that was you can wear glasses, but I think it just depends on the extent to it. I think how you sort of deal with those setbacks kind of matters more than anything else, and I think in some ways I feel really lucky because my eyes have been opened to a different perspective. I've had the privilege of working and meeting many pilots, and actually I always find it really fascinating with some of them. They're kind of envious of the position that I had, which was you actually could influence this operation and you could make things better. We sit here really frustrated, and I think I have sometimes imagined that were I a pilot, I would have been really frustrated, and I would have ended up wanting to go into management roles because I would have said, I need to fix this. Like this is not how it should be working. So I kind of see this sort of glass half full view as well, which is, okay, if this isn't working, try something else, but keep it related to your underlying passion, because that's kind of what's going to motivate you and fuel the fire of passion inside you.
The one key thing that I've pulled out from that, and it's brilliant, is you called on help a couple of times. You mentioned that I spoke to someone and I asked, how do I fill out this box and stuff? I'm going to be honest, I never did that. I had a brother in aviation. I never called on. I don't know. I found it difficult to sort of say how can I best go about that. Was that just second nature to you? Was that easy to call on that help? Because often people don't, right? They just do it in isolation and fail themselves, or they don't seek advice.
I think people need to be more confident in saying that they don't know something and asking for help, because and I think I've done this quite a lot. I remember even in university times when I was applying for different roles and functions in some of the different societies, in some specific questions would ask you, do you have experience in this field? And my answer was no, but I do actually have 5 contacts who could help me with this. The truth is no one is an oracle in any field, and most of the best inventions are created by a group of people coming together with different thoughts and diversity of opinions. And I think that's really important. So sharing thoughts and asking for help, I think, is important. And my kind of approach to this is, I have had countless people who have given me incredible advice, great counsel. And my approach is to make sure that I do the same to those as well who are new to an industry or coming anew and are seeking advice, because that's sort of how I think you will get the best out of society. So asking for help is important, and I think that probably needs to come from having the confidence in saying that you don't know something. And that is sometimes the hardest thing, because it's not a sign of weakness not to know. And too many people can just make things up. And I think that is when cracks really start to form. Because once you start that and you go down that path, it's very, very difficult to reverse, because how do you unwind that situation? Yeah. And so it's much better to always be honest. If you don't know something, be open about it. Ask for help, because there's bound to be a number of people that will be able to give you the right advice.
Yeah,
amazing.
Just on the help piece, because then we talk about help, but actually we've got to university now, and we've got to our first job, as you will. Where does family sit into this? What kind of support, what kind of help have you had from family along that way to kind of, like I said, to get to Cambridge and then to get to a grad scheme with British Airways, a really, really, really well respected grad scheme. What role did family play in that?
Family were incredibly sort of important. I mean, so my background, for those who don't know, is I was actually born in Sarajevo in Bosnia in '89. So the war that started in former Yugoslavia in the early 90s, we left Bosnia and came to London as refugees. So it was my mum, my grandmother, my sister and I that left. And my dad, he left many years later, but ended up working abroad. And I think being outsiders in the UK, and certainly for my mum, for example, who was learning English and ended up teaching English, and for me and my sister kind of readjusting, we got a lot of help. And I think that's probably where some of this comes from. And we were a really tight-knit community ourselves. So family played a really important part. They sort of always encouraged and let us live to our sort of dreams of what we wanted to do. We were given the freedom to explore, try different things out, different activities, different sports. And everything kind of led to sort of feeling that sense of security to say, I'm enjoying this, I'm not enjoying this, I want to explore this further, etc. So I got tremendous sort of support and encouragement from my entire family. My sister, who actually is also works at British Airways, has sort of followed into the aviation footsteps. I think we're so close that she almost sort of ended up being consumed in my obsession with aviation that she's gone into that same.
She had no choice.
Exactly. Yeah, it's sort of addictive.
Trust me, it
happens, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Which one of you were first to?
So yeah, me. I obviously went in when I was 19. And I think my dad actually was the first, So my dad used to work on the ramp, and I think I've said it before, and I know Reza would say it as well, is that we actually, for us, it was everything around us. We'd be sitting here having a conversation somewhere along the line, because family, everything was around that. My dad came to this country when he was 16, and his first job was working in industrial washing machines for British Airways when they used to have the catering units. So life was aviation. As you grew up outside of school, that's all you talked about. And actually, I always say that's the last thing I want to do. I do not want to work in aviation. And but actually, here we are, and here we are promoting it, because I think, as you say, it's so diverse. It is all consuming. It's a massive industry with so much opportunity and potential.
And I think there's something magical about it. Like, at the end of the day, you look out the window at sort of 35,000 feet, and you're thinking, how? And it is an amazing experience. And you can be on a plane, and 12 hours later you're in Tokyo. Yeah. It is just a remarkable experience. That's something that you wouldn't have been able to imagine some 120 years ago.
Yeah. So that's a great way to sort of dive into a bit more of the grad scheme that you joined, and then how did your career progress in that post that grad scheme, and then going on to your what we're labeling as your meteoric rise now.
That's very kind. So I think that the first thing when I joined, I was actually probably a little bit surprised by what I found, because I think part of the challenge when you've spent the best part of your sort of childhood dreaming about working for British Airways is you have an incredibly high expectation of it. And I joined and was given a computer with Office 2000 on it. And I'd never used Office 2000, right? Like, I think the earliest version I'd used was the 2005 or whatever version existed. And I just couldn't believe that an airline was being run with this kind of sort of technology. And I remember very early on in sort of the grad scheme, and I was placed in engineering, which for those who don't know aviation or don't know British Airways well, the engineering department is probably about 2-3 miles away from the head office. So you're sort of a little bit also away from HQ. And I remember one of the sort of financial controllers at the time asked every single person in finance, if I gave you £500, can you write a business case for what you would spend this on that would give a return to sort of improve BA? And I wrote a business case saying I want to buy Office 2010 because I can't keep working with Office 2000. Firstly, there was a row limit in Excel, after which you then had to sort of like knit together different files. And I just want access to far more features that latest versions of Office have. And to be fair, I think he was a bit surprised, but agreed. So I was given the first sort of like engineering finance Office 2010, I think it was. And I just was slightly surprised at how, not tedious, but how difficult certain aspects of the work were. It just wasn't what I imagined it to how it would be run. Right? I was imagining an incredibly slick kind of process, but it was very, very manual. Filtering spreadsheets, monthly tracking, everything was incredibly, incredibly manual. And I then realized actually there was quite a lot of scope to improve some of these processes. How could you automate some of them? How could we apply some this is before the huge growth in AI stuff, right? But how can we apply some of this sort of system technology, automation, macros into these spreadsheets to make things more efficient? And one thing I was surprised by is actually some of the resistance that you can be met by people who just don't want that kind of disruption in the day-to-day. And I think I started over the course of sort of the first 3 to 6 months feeling a bit like an imposter, where I was like, I feel like I want to do more and more, but I'm kind of being held back. So I started to doubt myself around whether I'd made the right choice. And in parallel, some of my friends who'd gone into some of the consulting houses were talking about some of these fascinating projects that they were working on and how in the deep end they're thrown and they're really trying to crack some of these problems. So I started to think, oh God, have I made a mistake? And by pure coincidence, and I class it as coincidence, some would say you make your own luck. I'd managed to sort of network and find a few people within BA's parent company, IAG, who invited me to shadow them on a few occasions. And I don't know how it happened. I don't know whether it's just chemistry or people see that passion. They just said, "Oh, let's stay in touch." And I was invited to different events and kind of just to broaden my own horizons and gain experience. One of them was the AGM in Madrid, which I was invited to join. And through that, I just happened to meet more and more people. And I was asked by one person candidly what my thoughts were on BA and my sort of, I think it was about 9 months by that point. And I was really honest with them. I said, look, if I'm honest, I'm just, it's not what I expected. And I've been slightly doubting myself around whether I'd made the right choice, because I thought I'd be getting involved in some really cool, interesting tasks. And actually, it's a bit more mundane than what I thought. And then I thought, well, I've just kind of told somebody senior in IAG that perhaps, one of their main airlines is, I'm being a bit critical of it. And they just turned around and said, don't leave, come and join us. And come and join our finance department. And so I then moved after 1 year on the BA scheme to IAG in investor relations. And actually it was, and again, even when I was at BA, we were offered to do different accountancy qualifications. And I said, I'd kind of like to do this banking one. So my friends were doing which was the CFA. And obviously, policy 136 says no. So that was the answer. And when I was in IAG, which is obviously a relatively new company at that stage, obviously huge, but new, I asked if I could do the CFA qualification instead. They said, yeah, why not? Suits investor relations really well. And then I spent a good few years really at the sort of top view of how a corporate communicates to its shareholders and to its investors, how you take all of the information from the different operating companies and digest it, communicate it in a regulated environment, of course, that you have to when you're a publicly traded company. And it just gave me great exposure to how, in essence, the industry functions, because suddenly you are exposed not just to one airline, but also to competitors, to investors, your benchmarks, how you compare to other people, etc. And it just completely changed my perspective and my horizons, and I really, really enjoyed it. And that's where I think I probably spent that role was the longest I've ever spent in a single kind of department, which was investor relations, before I moved into treasury.
So there's a amazing pieces to unpack there. I mean, but one key one, and I think it's come up as a theme for anyone who's watched the previous episodes, is the initiative. The initiative you took to reach out, to network, to ask for someone's time, to shadow, to communicate to others. There's an art and a skill to that. Is the confidence aspect. There is the behavior aspect of how to interact with someone and understanding that. Is that something you found challenging? Is that something you definitely encourage others to do, that you've encouraged people that you've interacted that are younger, who you see have the same energy as you? Is that one key thing?
I'm going to stop him. You have just kind of blazoned over the fact, because actually you've said you've got the support in terms of how to help write the application. You've talked to a few people at university when the pilot piece didn't work out. Casually speaking to people at IAG and being invited to AGMs. And we see this with a lot of guests, because for them, they've done it. So for them, it's like, I don't understand this. That's quite a big deal.
So I think people have asked me this question before, and I think my answer is, when people say, how do I improve my networking? I sometimes think that's the wrong question to ask, because I inadvertently ended up with a strong network. I was curious and I wanted to learn. And I think sometimes the worst thing somebody can do is force network, where they think I have to go and talk to this, and this because I need something. And I think the difference is, if you are, and it all comes down ultimately to passion and curiosity and interest. I sought out to talk to these people, not because I thought they can help me. It's because I thought, I'm really interested in what you've got to say. And I'm really interested in answers to these questions. I remember talking to some people. I was like, when BA decided to retire the Concorde, I just wanted to know how that decision was made. And that was my sort of approach to some people. I was like, honestly, I want to know how you came to make that decision, from everything from the Air France crash to the market to the oil price, having to put the armoring in the fuel tanks. Like, I'm just curious. And then you enter into a dialogue and a discussion, and people love also talking about their experiences, especially when they're also passionate. And then you find the chemistry, and you find the sort of common ground. And then it's kind of only after that you realise you can reach out to this person, and they're going to help you, and they kind of inadvertently go, let us know if you need something else, or how's this going, how's that going. So I think it's sort of that a network is built inorganically, in that it comes from interpersonal connections that aren't forced. They need to sort of be natural, and they need to come from a genuine interest in what it is that you're doing or want to learn, as opposed to just for the sake of networking. And I think when people ask me, I'm going to this conference, I'm going to this, how do I network? I don't know the answer to that. My answer is just talk to people as if you are talking to your friends, and see where the conversation goes, and you will then inevitably, if you find common ground, find click.
Be authentic, isn't it? And
Exactly.
that's the point. I think sometimes you're right. I know when people approach me, sometimes you're in the back of their mind thinking they want something, and like you said, that can close off even the mindset of your audience, right? That person's already thinking, I'll just wait, and eventually that sell will come, or what they want will come. Whereas actually a very much nicer way of doing that is actually, like you said, coming from that place of curiosity.
And that's, everyone has that experience, right? It's like, think of a salesperson, and you know how you like to be sold to, right? And how often does the kind of like forced, it feels like you're doing this for the sake of doing it, it's your job, etc. It's just, you don't get the same connection as when somebody comes with a personal service and says, oh, hello Ben, like, how are you, like, and you just get a very different reaction when it comes from a place of genuine warmth and curiosity.
It's a great insight.
But do you think there's an issue there going forward? Because I say the next generations and coming up are so used to text format conversations behind a phone and WhatsApp, would rather text than ring. That interpersonal communication, that reading the room and understanding someone and lighting up in a conversation. Do you think that skill is becoming less common and becoming harder to sort of nurture?
But personally, I do, and I think it's obviously also magnified by the remote working and the fact that a lot of stuff is done on Teams or Zoom, etc. And I personally prefer in-person conversations. I think you just get so much more of the body language and the non-verbal communication that comes from somebody. I think it is proving more and more challenging, because it is hard to really gauge someone from a Teams meeting or from a Zoom or from a video the way you would if it's sort of interpersonal. And also, it depends on the context and the environment, right? If you are at a conference or if you're at a work social event, etc., the atmosphere is different. The atmosphere in a Teams meeting is always the same. I mean, during COVID and lockdowns, we all had those socials on Teams where different friends would come together, and it's just not the same. That hasn't lasted, right? So I think there is something to be said about the generation and the technology that people have been brought up with, and is that harder to make those genuine connections or not? But I guess I can't necessarily relate, because I haven't adapted to that. Perhaps they have, and perhaps that generation will deal with it differently and find different ways of finding those connections.
Yeah, agreed.
Good stuff. Okay. So yeah, you've taken us, that's quite interesting now. Like you said, I think the way you talked about the investor relations role, actually, now even for us, it gives us a lot of insight into now how Ben used to think, actually, because actually where we've gone from is a budding pilot to then going into engineering, to then looking at finance, having that curiosity. Now, like you said, that was one of the longest roles, stints you did in your career so far. What came next and why?
So I think people realised that I was getting a little bit sort of, not impatient, but I was getting sort of towards the end of, I'd really learnt a great deal in the time there. And so I was asked if I would swap roles with another colleague of mine who was working in group treasury, which is where, in essence, the group looks after the cash and raises financing and does all the sort of deals with mortgages for aircraft, etc. And I said, yeah, that sounds great. I'm really interested. And so I then took on that role, and I was helping negotiate and close some of the paperwork for aircraft financing deals. And I was getting really excited. I'm like, do you know what? Finally, like, I'm starting to deal with aircraft, because the office used to overlook the runway, but you were sort of really far removed from anything operational. Yeah. And ironically, my sister at that point was working in the operation, so she every now and then would send me pictures from the ramp or from the flight deck, where she was on the ground, and I'd sort of get these sort of pangs of jealousy, being like, that's what I want to be doing. Yeah. And I think I finally got my sort of wake up call when I'd be getting these like 300-page bundles of per aircraft that we were financing. I had to sort of read through them, make sure all the numbers and the text was correct, etc. Get the lawyers, then get the right signatories, and get it all signed. And there was one thing that used to happen, and despite being able to fly to different banks in the world and negotiate with investors, which was just absolutely no problem whatsoever, I used to have to make one phone call before we signed the final bits of paper, which is to ops control, because these were BA aircraft, in BA, to just double check where the aircraft was to make sure there weren't any tax implications. We just wanted to make sure it was on the ground at Heathrow. And for some reason, I was just like really worried about making that phone call. I'm like, what if I'm disturbing them? Like, what if they're like in the middle of something, right? And at that point, I had no idea that, some 4 years later, I'd be, sitting in that very department. And I think that's when I kind of thought, I really want to be with the operation and the aviation and the aircraft. Because whilst we were financing these brand new aircraft, we never got to see them, right? You didn't get to go on board. I had no idea whether they had a new aircraft smell, right? Just no idea whatsoever. So I said, okay, well, I want to go back into the operation. And what I then did is I wanted to sort of make a leap back into BA. There was options in other parts of the group. The one really big strength of IAG was the ability to move talent across different airlines and different countries. And I was genuinely considering a move to Spain, but it was just my personal circumstances. I just wanted to settle in London. I just bought a flat, and I was like, I'm settling here. And I thought, okay, well, how do I make this move from corporate finance in the parent company to something that's a bit more relatable to operations or the airline? Yeah. And at that time, BA was getting a new chief executive and chief financial officer. And because IAG is quite a small community, and obviously it's filled with all the different CEOs from the different airlines, I had a conversation with the incoming BA CEO and CFO and said, look, you guys are about to embark on a really difficult, transition. You might need some help. Do you just want somebody to help troubleshoot things for you, analyze stuff, just help in whatever way possible? And I actually wrote my own job description and just gave it to them and said, perhaps something like this. And I think they were like, oh, okay, fair enough.
Ben, people don't do this.
This is not normal.
How casually you were talking about it.
Somebody did advise me to do that as well.
A good
friend of mine as well, right? So they said, why don't you just do this? Because I thought, this is pretty bold, right? And I think they said, no, they'll need the help. Just write it. And, if they say no, they say no. So, yeah, I mean, I guess it is in sort of hindsight quite a sort of bold thing to do. But I took the risk and I wrote this sort of business manager job description, which was in essence saying, help in whatever you need. And I then submitted this. They said, yep, okay. And I started on the same day as they did, and basically was just doing odd projects. So anything that was on their agenda that needed a bit more attention, that perhaps was controversial or just needed something to help kind of, smooth the waters.
What an opportunity.
It was incredible, but it also honestly opened my eyes to how sort of senior management and frankly senior politics works, and actually how much briefing was going on behind the scenes between different kind of factions and departments and everything else. Because I used to get told information that people would not be willing to tell the CEO, and I'd be like, well, why not? Just go and tell them. Like, oh no, we can't. And it's like, well, I'm going to deliver the same message. Yeah, you do it. And I just really found that quite an interesting odd. It's just, people just weren't willing to sort of
corporate politics.
Yeah. So I said, okay, that's great. And then I was offered the opportunity to become the head of Heathrow Terminal 3, which is BA's ground operations team in Heathrow for one terminal. And boy, that proved controversial, because those who knew me thought actually he could do this. Those who didn't know me or only knew me on the fringes thought this guy has
no clue.
He's got no idea. He can't, handle people. Like, the unions are gonna tear him apart, and they're gonna walk. There'll be a strike, and at that point I was like, almost like, well, I'm gonna prove these people wrong, right? But it was getting more and more difficult to actually kind of secure the role. So I applied, went through the full interview process, etc., and I was really put through the ringer, rightly so. And it was kind of stalling, partly because of this. But in the end, it came through. And I genuinely went overnight from never managing anyone in my life sort of directly to suddenly having this team of 800 staff, from check-in to handling to the sort of duty managers, etc. And unsurprisingly, if somebody says, what's the first thing I did, is I picked up the phone to actually a colleague of mine who joined the grad scheme the same day I did. He was on a different scheme instead of the finance one. I think he was on the procurement one originally, but he was running Terminal 5 at that point, and he'd been in the operation for a few years, maybe I think at least 12 months or so. I picked up the phone to him and I said, can we please meet for dinner once a week, because I need as much help as I can get to know how to make this work. And he said, yeah, of course. So I actually ended up chatting once a week, just sort of saying, look, how does this work? Like, how do I deal with this? What's the relationship with the unions like, etc. And I loved... And in fact, the team that I hired in T3, we joked, and even to this day, they're some of my close friends now, we still say, and we remember the conversation, that this will be the best role we'll ever have, because it was quite a contained department inside a mammoth organisation. Therefore, you're sort of about 1.5 miles away from T5, which means you're not part of the mothership, and therefore you're given a bit more autonomy. And the boss that I had at the time was unbelievably supportive and gave me incredible freedom, but with knowledge that there was a safety net and advice was always available. And so it was just a remarkable environment to operate in. And I think I spent 2 years in that role. And what I found really fascinating is that the finance world is incredibly well controlled. There are processes, policies, governance, getting documents signed, going to approvals, this approval, that approval, etc. And I had assumed that operations is going to be similar, right? Because we are getting these aircraft into the air, right? There are so many things that need to happen. There must be some really structured processes. And what I found is that every single department had their own processes, but they were not orchestrated together in any kind of coordinated way. And I sometimes thought that it was sort of chance that made this aircraft depart on time. It was always safe. I had no doubt ever that anything was unsafe, because the processes were always driven from a perspective of making sure that everything was safe and secure. But from a punctuality and efficiency perspective, it was sort of, you will do this by this time, you will do this by this time, neither of you will talk, but you can't do this until you've done that. And so it kind of just doesn't always sync together. And I actually remember walking from the offices in T3 to one of the gates, and I honestly had no idea whether the aircraft was even on stand. And it was about, I think, 90 minutes to departure. I had no system. I could make some phone calls and ask, but I myself could not log into anything, and it could tell me whether there was a physical 747 at the time on its way due to Cape Town on stand. And that's when I thought, okay, well, we need to fix this. And so I then started to talk to IT and a couple of other sort of internal transformation teams. I think they were there at the time, saying, I've got some ideas on how we can fix this. And they just said, no, like, no, either can't do it, or priority is too low down the list, or this is too ambitious. It's not achievable. And one December, I remember, and this is kind of what the straw that broke the camel's back. We had a worse than forecast snow storm in Heathrow, and I remember this really well because one of the guys who joined my team, it was his first day, and he arrived, and the first thing he said is, right, look, what can I help with? And it was huge queues in the terminal. And I said, can you help? I need you to help manage this queue. In fact, I need you to close this queue because the desks are about to close and we physically cannot handle all these people. And I think it was probably about a good 3-4 hours worth of people who'd been standing there. And it was an environment that I just never wanted to be part of again. It was, letting people down, people who were due to fly on honeymoons, people who had urgent business trips, visiting friends and relatives. And I felt powerless because I couldn't do it. We were overwhelmed with the volume. And I sort of went back to some of the tech team and said, look, I need a solution for this problem and this problem. And I can't have people queuing. I don't want to see, a family with an infant in a 2-hour queue when we can triage them and have them in other parts of the terminal. And again, okay, well, we could look at this. I need you to fill out this project brief. And the project brief was like an 8-page template. And I could have said, no, like I've had it. I could write the source code quicker myself, and it would be shorter than this project brief. So I'm going to just do that, and then let's see what happens. And I had an incredibly supportive boss who kind of knew what I was doing and said, yeah, go for it. And so I started basically developing some prototypes that I wanted to improve both the customer experience but also the operational sort of coordination at the terminal. And I launched these, and I'm sure they caused a huge amount of controversy with IT in particular because they were, to anyone who works in IT will have a heart attack. I hosted my own personal AWS account. I followed all of sort of the best cyber standards, etc., encryption at rest, in transit, everything else, how to sign in, log in, etc. But of course, it did break every protocol. If it wasn't for the fact that the tool proved popular, I'm certain that I should have been fired. Yeah. But I think the business really liked what I was creating. And as a result of that, I was then asked by the chief operating officer at the time if I would join his leadership team as the head of global operations, or director of global operations that it's called now, which is basically running the control center that 24/7 looks after all of BA's operation. That very control center that I was nervous phoning some 2 years before, asking whether this aircraft was on the ground. And that's when I then took that role, and the rationale behind it was all systems basically reside in the control center. And a lot of airlines have incredibly legacy and archaic ops systems that no one fully understands how they work. And so modernizing it has always been a challenge. The implementation and the projects that do some of that are in years and years. And I'd been implementing new tech in T3 in the space of sort of months. And so the question was, well, it clearly is possible to do this. So let's try and do this. So that's then when I took on the global ops remit, which was in back end of 2019.
Jeez. Ben, again, this is not normal. Like, so it's great to see the other side, where there's delays happening. A lot of people blame the airline. I'm waiting here 4 hours. The snow is a natural occurrence, but you have to deal with that. But you taking the customer obsession lens and taking the customer problem, putting yourself in their shoes to then go above and beyond and create a solution yourself. Albeit, yes, you've had to break some barriers and things to do that, but your managers and your leadership allowing you to do that in a controlled, safe environment. That's pretty amazing to be able to encourage that and support and saying, what, you've seen a genuine problem, we've seen a solution. Okay, it's working now. How do we support you to grow that? I think that's amazing. Like, we should.
I would also add that I think one forgotten group, as well as obviously focusing on the customer, is there's also the focus on the employees and the team, because it's not pleasant for the teams at an airport to be facing the brunt of genuinely and rightly frustrated customers whose plans have been disrupted. And giving them the right tools is equally as important, because too often we find ourselves in situations where customers know more about what's going on than the employees, and or at least the frontline employees, whether it's the crew, whether it's the check-in teams or the boarding teams, etc. And that was something that I really didn't like, because actually, if you want to impress the customer, or if you want to solve the customer's issue, it's not going to be someone in a control room that's going to do it. They may make the best decision, but that decision is only the best decision if it can actually be communicated with those who are going to be delivering the message or delivering the solution. Yeah. And I think that was one of the other pain points that I was really frustrated by. And a lot of the technology that I certainly am looking to develop, and that I think others miss a lot, is the focus on the user experience for the staff. Because if it's not intuitive for them, and if it's not relevant for them, they're not then empowered to actually give the best information to the customers. And that is part of the battle as well. Because if you create solutions that are not intuitive, and I always use Apple as a great example, like the Apple iPhone is just a remarkable piece of design. Like, not just engineering, but design as well. Like, it's so intuitive that it is so easy for people to learn, even if you hadn't ever been exposed to technology. And I mean, I'm sure you guys remember, like, Blackberries, Nokias, like, you got lost in the settings. You didn't, like, it was almost too configurable. And I think that's part of the challenge with operational systems, is actually making them really relevant to frontline teams, so that it's easier to learn, especially in an environment where we are today, where actually retention and staff turnover is very different to what it was 20 years ago. So training is a big part of this.
Yeah. But going back to what Raza was saying there, so I think, so we talk about you going into the operation and about people. I'm going to share a very interesting story here, because I was obviously on a receiving end of Ben. I used to work at Gatwick, and very similar to T3, that environment where you can be a bit more loose and a bit more innovative. And also, I think you could hide away talent there as well. So I remember getting an email from my boss with the chain coming from IAG to say, we've got someone who wants to come and shadow, And this was, I think, a few weeks before you went over to Terminal 3. And I think these stories of, as you say, there's this perception of, who's this guy? We never heard of him in the operation. We're all in the operation. We would have heard of this guy. What is going on here? And I remember we caught up very briefly. And going back to your story there, you were talking about going to Terminal 3 on a gate. I'll share quite a funny story I remember you sharing once with me. So Ben rings me quite late at night and says, so I need to talk to you. I was like, what's up? I'm at the gate here, and staff are standing here. They're not doing anything. And I was like, right. I said, what's going on? He goes, well, they've been assigned the task. They're waiting for the aircraft. They're just... I mean, this can't be right. I mean, this is when I started to realise Ben's, desire to see things moving in efficiency. And, I listened for about 20 minutes, to be fair. And then in the end, I think I said to you at the time, I said, there are battles you pick, Ben. And I think going to the two staff members right now at the end of their shift to tell them that they should be doing more is probably not one if you want to win the minds of people. But I think it goes back to, like you said, building those safe zones, those environments. It's great to hear how you reached out to your colleague and Terminal 5 as well, about being able to have those conversations, right, without putting your foot in it, understanding the bigger picture. But yeah, just one I as you were talking, it reminded me of that time, and I thought to myself, you have to be in those environments. And going back to that point, are you a people person? I think today it actually demonstrates that. Your focus around the tech is about trying to make life easy for people, whether that's customers or employees. And I think going back to when we talk about what we try and do here is try and break these things down, is for people to see you're clearly a very intelligent individual. You're strong with numbers. That's helped you where you are today. But actually the core of it does come down to wanting to deliver for your customer, whether that's your teams or whether that's the actual end user itself in terms of the customer experience. So I think, hopefully that you've answered that for yourself when you've heard that. But actually, I think it's a nice way to bring that together to actually answer that question. I think, Ben is definitely a people person.
Well, the people element is always the fascinating one, because again, those who know me will say, I don't understand why people say you're not a people person, and those who don't hear stories and so you're obviously like, this person has no EQ kind of whatsoever. And funnily enough, I had a professional coach, and I shared the story with him once. I said, people used to sort of say openly in meetings, Ben, you have no EQ. And the coach responded to me and said, how did you respond to that? And I said, I just laughed and didn't really say anything. And he goes, that's probably the only thing you could do, because anything else would show no EQ. So it's quite ironic in some ways. I think the biggest challenge with kind of the people side, and the T3 was an incredible, not just experience, but learning for me, because it was genuinely, I changed from day one to the end of my 2 years. And discussions with trade unions and actually talking to different people, there were some changes that I did in T3 where I'd underestimated how long it would take people to get used to the change, and not everyone was going at the same pace as I was. And I had some amazing trade union reps who really helped open my eyes and show me that perspective. The one side that I wanted to touch on with the people bit is that I think one thing that is lacking hugely in management is honest conversations. And I think that people can be unfairly judged, because if you start tackling poor behaviors or poor performance in an honest way and point it out to people, then that doesn't happen very often. And I think it's a disservice both to the exceptional people who work, because they see poor performance not being managed, and then standards eventually kind of erode and slip. But those conversations are really, really difficult to have. And I think there are a few people, in my experience, who've ended up with a poor reputation because that's the only thing that's talked about, is the fact that they are managing this. And in an environment, which I think is very common, that people don't have those conversations, and poor performance, or a lack of performance even, is tolerated. When you go into an environment and start changing that, it is inevitable that it's going to ruffle feathers and cause. But actually, there is a wealth of exceptional people who get on with the work, do the best that they can, have pride in what they do, who actually look at that and say, finally. And actually, that was one of the most overwhelming bits of feedback I got that I really, really liked in T3, was those people who were passionate about the brand, passionate about the airline, passionate about the customers. They used to say, we recognize what you're trying to do, and we appreciate it. And yes, there were always... I remember speaking to one of the CEOs at BA, who, when I asked him, what it's like being a CEO, he goes, what you need to remember with something like BA is when you've got tens of thousands of people, you're not just a CEO. This is like running a little town. And in every town, 0.1% are going to be the town fool or the town jester. Like, how you deal with those is also important, but you've got to expect it. And very often, people can spend a huge amount of their time on just a very small minority of population. And actually, you've got to balance that and also listen to the stories of what happens to the silent majority. How do you recognize people? How do you reward people? How do you give advice to people? How do you coach them? And one of the things that I used to always encourage my team and what I used to do is, the most empowering thing I remember is I never did a training course on how to use the systems for check-in or the systems for those ones. I would sit down next to an agent and just say, can you do me a favor? Could you show me how this works? And they just thought, gosh, like, how valuable am I? Like, I know something that my department head doesn't know, and I am showing them. And they just felt incredibly satisfied. Like it was recognition.
Yeah.
And I think that is something, asking for help from your own team is also equally important, because I think that's the difference between leadership and management, right? You don't have to be an expert in everything. You need to know who to ask.
I mean, there's so much to unpack, Ben. I mean, we've only got to 2019 just yet, and we haven't even talked about, what is effectively, well, we're going to talk about in the face of aviation, because now we have hindsight that the world was not coming to an end, but it very much felt that way. Already a meteoric rise to running the integrated ops center for one of the largest airlines in the world. So let's kind of delve into what happened in 2019.
So 2019, I started towards the back end. I think it was called Q4, and I was just kind of getting my feet under the desk, sort of learning the lay of the land, understanding this. Had done a number of trips to other equivalent IOC stations from partner airlines as well. And come January or so, where COVID started, I was actually in Atlanta, and I was talking to another airline just to discuss different strategies and approaches, etc., and system landscape. And we sort of said, oh, can we just have a 10-minute side conversation about what your approach is to China and the flights? And I think at that point we'd sort of said, oh, we'll do a week cancellation, and hopefully we'll be back. So it was certainly a completely unknown type of scenario. And then, of course, it slowly started to get worse and worse and worse. And I was asked at one point to lead the COVID response, because under the IOC was also the sort of resilience plan and all the kind of emergency responses, etc. And so I took on that role, and again was surrounded by some exceptional people that were able to help, because we'd never been through anything like this before. And I was being asked by others around what our cancellation policy was, because in an airline, the commercial and scheduling network team pass over a schedule to operations about sometimes anywhere between 7 and 14 days before departure time. And the operations job is to just fly it, right? Our job is to fly as much of it as possible.
Exactly.
And now we're in an environment where actually loads of customers are cancelling their bookings. It's now becoming unviable to fly some of these routes. And we didn't have a policy for this. Ops were never set up to do any of this. And so between myself and commercial and a few others and the analytics team, we sort of came up with, right, let's work out how we can look at these bookings. When is the right time to cancel? What do we do with the crew, etc.? And we were having to sort of create on the fly analytics and processes and use kind of logic to think what is the best way to do this. And by and large, we got it right. And of course, you also have the very, very human element, which is in this great unknown, we were starting to get, understandably so, resistance from crew who were getting apprehensive about, for example, especially the situation in Italy, around operating flights out there. And we'd sort of had a view of like, under what circumstances do we start cancelling flights, etc. And when Italy ended up on the government's list of all but essential travel, I think we made the decision to say, okay, look, it's untenable to continue flying there. I think what we'd inadvertently done, which was then corrected for all future countries that we had to sort of pull out from, is we perhaps cancelled a little bit too soon, because we didn't repatriate everybody back and then sort of had to do relief flights. And I think it was foggy because you were not giving perfect information.
Yeah.
The circumstances were changing day in, day out. Government advice was completely all over the place. And you were really being pulled in different directions, because we were being contacted by different governments. We were being contacted by cruise companies who had stranded people. And we were orchestrating relief flights all across the world. And one thing that I was really touched by was the number of people who were willing to volunteer to operate these flights, despite the circumstances, to repatriate citizens back to their countries. We had cruise liners that were, stranded, that couldn't port until they eventually found one. They then had to be brought back home. And there was just a huge wealth of sort of energy and volunteers who were willing to kind of do everything they could in this kind of national emergency. But it was incredibly challenging, because you didn't have perfect information at all.
Yeah.
And you were having to try and collect it from disparate sources.
Well, anyone hearing this, it sounds like a scary environment to operate in. But given what we've heard of you today, correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like it's almost an opportunity where someone like yourself can thrive, where you are looking to make quick decisions. I mean, I'm hearing, about what you're doing there with analytics in terms of making decisions very quickly, trying to find solutions for people. It felt like in the crudest way, you were in the element.
I was, and I think that's probably one of the strengths that I hope I brought there, was being able to get through things quickly, because I think a lot of large corporates will spend a huge amount of time trying to get everything to the nth degree and understand as much as possible before making a decision. And operations is not like that. You don't have your luxury of hindsight is amazing, but you don't have that in the moment. And I'll give you one of the best examples. I was finishing up one day, and I was walking back towards the car. All the lights in Waterside were off. It was dark, and I bumped into a colleague of mine who, through bizarre channels somehow, was contacted by the State Department in the US, and they said, "Look, we've got American citizens who are stranded in Morocco. They're about to implement a massive lockdown." In fact, I think Sohail, I might have phoned you about this.
You did.
They've completely locked down, or about to implement practice. I think it was almost martial law. Don't quote me on that, but whatever it was like you wouldn't be able to drive through the streets. And there was no mechanism for any of the US carriers to be able to get aircraft to Morocco in time before, and to get them out before everything kind of locked down. And he said to me, "God, it's such a shame, because I don't think we can help." And I went, "What do you mean we can't help? Why can't we help?" And he goes, "Well, we're not going to be able to get aircraft there tomorrow." And I said, "Well, why not?" And he sort of looked at me and said, "Well, can we?" I said, "Yeah, I'm sure we can. Let's see what we can do. Let's give me 15 minutes." So I think I phoned you,
Yes.
and I said, "Sohail," because you were looking after all of the Middle East at that point.
Yeah.
I said, "Sohail, if we wanted to send, I think it was 7 aircraft, sort of in an hour's schedule to you, could you handle them?" And you said, "Leave it with me." I then phoned the chief pilot, and I said, "Do you think you could get me 7 crews to operate these flights in sort of 12 hours notice?" And he said, "Leave it with me." And obviously I had the team that looked after all the aircraft, so I said, "Can you get me 7 aircraft tomorrow?" And they said yes. And then each of you phoned back and said, "We can do this." And so I said to my colleague, I said, "Look, let's get in touch with the US and tell them we'll send these aircraft, we'll bring them to London, and then we'll connect them onto our transatlantic services." And the next morning, having sort of furiously that sort of night before worked out the exact processes, we had completely bespoke, never done before style of check-in that, again, our security team were involved in to make sure that it was all compliant. And we ended up sending 7 aircraft, I think exactly 1 hour behind each other, and managed to bring back several thousand stranded US citizens to London in the space of about 24 hours. And that kind of approach of, well, why can't it be done? I think a lot of people really stepped up to help make that work. But it sometimes requires that sort of continuous curiosity of, well, why not?
Yeah.
And I know that's annoying for some people sometimes, but it's kind of what's needed to make this.
And
make
it's
this
so
work.
funny. I'm laughing here because I also have been on the receiving end of the announcements of Ben, and I've said, "So who is this person? What magic does he have that he's just moving around?" And he's like, he's the person that goes in the meeting room and just says why to everyone. I said, "Oh, really? What does that mean?" He's like, no, trust me, he can get to the bottom of anything by just asking why 5 times. And now you just repeated it. It reminded me of that whole conversation of Ben's the person who's going to sit in the room and he'll curiously ask the detail of why we can't do something. Explain why. Explain that again. To either the response will look stupid in front of everyone, that we can't do it because I don't have the right laptop or the right tools or something. Then we're like, well, we need to fix that, obviously, don't we? Or you actually get to a genuine solution of, well, I've learned something now. Now I know why we can't do that, so that makes things easier.
A lot of curiosity, I think a lot of bravery and a lot of courage comes out of today's story, actually. And I think that's quite inspiring because actually, again, you were in the thick of it, but actually even just when we had that situation, that became the start of an incredible repatriation journey because that laid the foundations for us to be able to do that. And yeah, being on the receiving end of that, I'd always be at one part of the operation thinking we can do stuff like this, but you need like-minded people to think that way and to be able to push that. And I think you've demonstrated that ability to push the envelope. You know, the cliche is push the envelope, and I think what we've seen today is exactly that. At every opportunity to push the envelope, whether that's personally, whether that's with a process, whether that's with a person, can they do better? Can we do better? And I think, you know, that for me today answers a lot of questions around who is this Ben Sehovic, you know.
Well, I think I'd say a lot of it like relies. You know, I get given a lot of this credit, but it's unfair because actually a lot of this relies on those who actually delivered this, right? Because like my role was to just to bring different people together. If it wasn't for you and your team and the suppliers who were helping us handle the aircraft, if it wasn't for some of the pilots who volunteered to do this and the crew, etc., it wouldn't have happened. I sometimes describe my role as like a conductor, right? Which is like I don't create any music. My job is to just try and orchestrate this and keep it in time. Because everyone that you speak to wanted to do the best that they could. The biggest battle was they just didn't know what they needed to do or how to do it. And that was actually the task, was actually just coordinating this and saying, if we bring these three things together, we can make this work. I owe a huge debt of gratitude to those who actually entertained some of these ideas and actually made them happen. And I'll give you one other quick story, which was the other thing is you've got to be willing to listen to what others around you are saying, because it's easy to sort of fall into the trap of thinking, well, everything I'm doing is right, and not taking any feedback at any point. In the middle of all of this going on, we did have one flight. So BA used to operate a London City to JFK service, and it operated out of London City, but it was under the BA mainline sort of brand.
Is this the infamous BA 001?
Yes, that's the BA 001, the 318.
Yeah.
And unsurprisingly, when COVID happened, heavy business route, that one, it was basically empty, practically. But for whatever reason, because we were doing the analytics for the flights very, very quickly, we'd basically just applied a filter to say, give me all Heathrow departures and arrivals. Gatwick was sort of looking after itself, and we had City looked after by City Flyer. And this JFK City flight basically just didn't appear in any report. And a colleague of mine just said to me one day, Ben, have you seen this one? It's flying out empty and coming back with one person on board. Like, does this sound right to you? And I said, no, it doesn't sound right. Leave it with me. I then asked the team to see if, look at this. They just forgot, which is absolutely fair enough with everything going on. And then about 2 days later, the same thing was happening. One person was flying out and it was coming back empty. And I said, look, I like, enough. Like, we can't keep flying empty planes over the Atlantic back and forth. And I made the call just before it was about to push back to cancel it. But by the time the message got to ops control, it had just pushed back and was about to take off from London City. And I remember it got airborne, and I said, well, okay, no worries, just divert the plane to Heathrow. We're going to end up needing it here to be able to sort of park it for a period of time. And that's the end of it. And they said, what do you mean divert it to Heathrow? I said, just divert it. Like, get the crew, divert it here, and then we'll rebook that one customer on our JFK Heathrow service. And it ended up diverting. But what was ironic is there was one, I think, blogger who was tracking this plane on flight radar and actually wrote an article saying something strange happened to the BA1. It reached 16,000 feet and then diverted to Heathrow. No medical emergency on board. Like, it wasn't planned to do that. Anybody had any idea what's going on? And I thought, God, if only these people knew exactly what was happening behind the scenes.
Yeah. So you're talking about being the orchestrator, right? And it sounds like you said even in the operation you identified a gap. It sounds like the next part of your journey is about maybe even replacing Ben Sehovic in that gap. And so you're now, before we move on to what's next, are there any kind of closing reflections on your life current, that was in the corporate world?
Well, I obviously I can't not mention that the last 2 years were probably some of the most incredible, because after the global ops experience and COVID, when BA appointed its new CEO, I was asked to join the management committee as the chief transformation officer. And I think the idea was, look, can you help apply some of this thinking to all of these other areas across BA and try and kind of influence and drive this change? And I which surprises many people. At first, was like, I don't really want to do that. Like, I love the operation. I'm in a role that gives me a huge amount of ability to try and improve things, and I'm going into this super influencing role where you really have nothing but a loud voice and an ability to influence, but you have no control or say. It was an incredible experience because it taught me a totally different skill set. But it was very different to what I was sort of my comfort zone in the ops world. I did that for a year before COVID ramp up for BA proved to be a challenge like it did for the entire industry. And in the final year before I left, I bridged the gap between the outgoing chief operating officer and the new incoming one for about a year. And to help with the ramp up, I think the logic was you help with the ramp down. Now, can you help with the ramp up? So I helped the ops ramp up for BA in 2023 to try and 2022. I can't remember exactly what year it was.
22.
22. So help the ramp up in 22 in order to try and stem some of the cancellations and get us back onto track.
I mean, like that was again where I quote my quote of the meteoric rise, and this is one thing I've raised in a previous podcast with Sahel, is this sort of inverted triangle of having youthful exuberance and the outside curiosity that sometimes get lost with sort of wisdom and age when people become C-level when they're older, especially now in the generations where it's so disparate on your typical possibly 45 to 50-year-olds to your new generation of customers. There's a wealth of difference in thinking and how possibly personas are. And having an intermediary who's probably raised in the era of tech, AI, mobile, Apple devices and things like that, and being native to that, so you're able to relate to those customers and help with that decision making, I think needs to be more common in especially FTSE 100 companies. I think we're starting to see it. A lot of young CEOs, a lot of more diverse background CEOs and C-levels coming in. I think it's so important. I call it I quote it as the inverted triangle of, yes, you learn your career, but you shouldn't be pointed towards the older you get is the higher you go. There should be movement up into that C-level quite faster, especially in your 30s and your 40s when you've got that energy and you've got that outside thinking and you can relate to your customers, especially next generational customers. Is that a challenge that you see commonly in the boardroom? Are you seeing that evolution in the boardroom?
I think it is a challenge for a few reasons. I think one of them is the more senior you get, the more removed you are from probably the parts of the job you would enjoy the most. And I think that is a challenge. It was a challenge for me, certainly, to adjust to, because you do more of the corporate side of things that perhaps you would prefer not to do. Mm-hmm. So when I was looking after operations on the exec, I spent so little time in the terminal that I kind of surprised myself. And part of that is because actually your role at that level is to be an ambassador for your department and interact a lot more with outside entities, with internal stakeholders, and kind of be a spokesperson almost for that department. And I think that is a different skill set. And what I would say is that in some cases, and I kind of laugh about this sometimes, but I feel like the most influence I ever had was when I was in T3 because it was small and you're able to actually enact the change. And I think what happens the more senior you get is the impact of your decisions are far greater, but the timeline for implementation is far greater. And therefore, you need a significant amount of patience to do it. And I think certainly in my experience, I think probably the older you get, the more patient you end up naturally kind of being. So sometimes in these large corporates, if you're very, very senior, you might get frustrated by the pace. But actually the pace is it's just the nature of what it's like there. Sometimes it's right. We were talking about that earlier. Like there are some amazing pros to being in a startup environment. But actually there are some parts of the big corporate that you're like, actually those checks and balances were actually really, really helpful.
Yes. Yeah.
And actually I'm going to take some of those and I'm going to embed them in now. And you kind of pick and choose what you want. Yeah. So I think the sort of the challenge at the sort of C-suite level is, I think diversity of thought is absolutely vital, and having a diverse group of backgrounds, race, everything, age is crucial. But I do see the the risk of impatience if you have this kind of desire for like change, realizing that actually at those levels the lead times are just so much longer, because the impact of what you're deciding is so much greater. I mean, I used to read these incredible books. I think one of them was called Where Power Stops, and it kind of told a story through different prime ministers and presidents around their experience of getting into sort of positions of power. And one of them said when they sort of walked into, I think it was number 10, they said, you think you're a puppet master, and it takes you a few months to realise that when you lift the strings up, they're not attached to anything. And this machinery that you're sort of think you're in charge of actually has a life of its own. And that's, I think, some of the dynamics that happens in large corporates that takes a bit of time to get used to.
That's a fascinating insight, and I think that's a nice way to kind of close that part, isn't it? Because it is about actually that curiosity, that drive to deliver, but actually having that sense of realism as well, because now those decisions are far greater and have far greater impact. But I think, look, what I will say listening to this, and I've certainly learned a lot more about you sitting here, and I think in the dynamisms of that organisation, people will understand a lot of what you're talking about. But actually, hopefully on this platform, people can start to understand how that journey comes about, and those kind of key qualities that you have shown to be able to inspire. These things are achievable. And I think hopefully out of that mechanism of British Airways, now we can kind of exemplify that across for many people to see that actually it is possible, and equally some of the skills that they need to harness and develop to be able to follow those type of footsteps. So I think hopefully you should be, and I hope you are very, very proud of what you've achieved so far. And that's the key thing now so far, because we want to hear about what comes next. Because, again, traditional now, let's go back to being traditional. You'd think, an individual has made it to a C-suite position. Why on earth would they not stick around to see that through?
Well, I think it stemmed from the desire to change things. And I think I was getting frustrated at the pace, and actually to be able to change and try things, you need to sometimes do it in a smaller environment. And I think that makes sense. So I got a lot more freedom when I was in T3 and less obviously in the bigger roles, and that's kind of understandable. I think what I'd always had an entrepreneurial sort of desire inside me, and I think I tried to apply that in the roles that I was doing when I was within BA and IAG. So it's not a surprise, because that's kind of always existed, and I think sometimes that kind of desire helped me succeed in those corporate roles. I think what kind of happened is, because I was doing an interim role, there naturally came a point of reflection, because the new chief operating officer started, and I was for the first time at a genuine crossroads, because I was basically thinking about what role or what should I do next, where in the past, kind of organically, things kind of came about. I went into T3 and then into global ops and then into sort of the transformation space. Ops was naturally, in response to what was going on operationally. And I think I was, for once, kind of given a bit of a chance to actually take stock of everything that had happened over the last sort of like 3 years and think about what I actually wanted to do. And ever since I did those apps in T3, and I've been doing software as a hobby, for years and years, even before then, I kind of thought I'd really want to try and change the landscape for operations in tech. And from the experience I had, a lot of the suppliers and a lot of the internal tech teams really didn't understand operations well enough. And operational teams tended not to embrace technology or data. It was very much driven on gut instinct. It's kind of like, edge of your seat type instinct and experience. And some of that muscle memory went during COVID because the operation was so much smaller. And I was like, look, I think there is a absolute wealth of information that is just not being used in operations that could be. A lot of the data is available. It's just not actually put in the right kind of format or sense to be able to be ingested and intelligence gleaned from it. And so I wanted to experiment with this And I think I had discussions, and it just was going to prove to be too difficult to do in a large corporate, especially with a lot of the bureaucracy that would come with being involved. And so I thought, look, if I'm ever going to scratch this itch, it's going to be now. And I'm at a genuine crossroads where it feels like things have come to a natural conclusion. And I have to say, everyone was incredibly supportive. Like I was really, really, really well supported. People were, saying they understand why I would want to leave. If they were in my shoes, they would, even though as a corporate, they wouldn't want to lose this kind of talent. They want entrepreneurial spirit. But they also said, look, we also don't want to hold you back. And I'd been given quite extensive kind of coaching to kind of like talk through these different things to decide kind of a path. And ultimately, it was in conversations, again, asking for advice from those that I trusted, who sort of said, look, you're young. You've not got really anything to lose. And if this fails, you'll just learn something from this anyway. If it succeeds, great. And look, like the door's always going to be open. So like, give it a go. You never know. You might end up selling this stuff back. Just prove it works somewhere smaller. And so I said, okay, well, I'm going to do this. I'm going to try this. And I left at the end of June 23 and was genuinely worried about, having spent 12 years, what it was going to be like. Am I going to lose a sense of my identity, etc. But I actually have loved it. Like, I've been able to spend a lot more time on myself. Like, for example, I've finally done my private pilot's license. So, one of the sort of dreams ticked. And I started to build a brand and a tech company whose aim is to transform the landscape for operations. So using better data, trying to modernize the estate. Like, one thing we didn't touch on is some of the IT outages that many airlines face, given the infrastructure that they have. And actually, a lot of that, if you were building a brand new estate, you wouldn't be suffering from, because you have totally different availability now.
Absolutely.
And what I wanted to do is try and create a greenfield build for an operating system for, in essence, the airline industry, not just for airlines, but it could be airports, handlers, etc. And really transform that landscape so that we are in a generation of high availability, high reliability, high redundancy, great UI, intuitive experiences for customers and for staff. Far more intelligent in terms of the ability to use AI. How can we use different technologies to give insights to decision makers so that we can augment what they're doing and recommendations, etc. And the ultimate goal is how not just to build that, but transition from today's estate, because anybody can paint you a vision.
Yes.
The hard bit is going from what you have today into what you want to go to next. And I think the experience that I'm hoping, not just myself, but the team that I'm building around this company to bring, is knowledge of technology, knowledge of the operation, but most importantly, knowledge of the change that happens. And that's something that I'm immensely grateful to the teams that have worked with me, who have taught me how change, especially when you're changing processes for people, how that change takes place. And that is something that I'm really passionate about, which is, how do we transition from today's systems, both from a technology perspective? How do we strangle the old? How do we nudge people in the right direction so they embrace this, aren't scared of it, don't sort of shun it away, don't think it's going to replace them, for example? Because I don't think we're in a world where AI can entirely replace an ops control center. We're nowhere near there. But we can augment more data towards people so they can make more informed decisions, improving communication, etc. So that is the ecosystem that I'm looking to build, and I'm in essence currently looking for clients and those who are willing to embark on that journey to create this.
That sounds really interesting.
I mean, you've got an amazing background to be able to take such a well-renowned carrier, albeit slightly legacy, and that needs to move forward and is moving forward, and having that background to sort of back your hypothesis and being relatable to something that's a smaller airline and being a full service carrier, for example, having that experience and being attuned to both. I think that's an amazing asset that you have, and real live operational experience, which is always something you should look for in a company that you're going to work with. And then yes, being very different in what you've just said in your little elevator pitch there is mentioning people. I had the word people a number of times, and with tech companies you don't. They just think they're doing the tech part, but the change management part that you mentioned is so important, because we're going to go through a number of tech transitions, and bringing those people on board so important. So I think that's a brilliant way to focus and where to focus.
I agree, because I think it's that is the gap that a lot of the incumbent suppliers don't think about. It's both the people element, but also just the actual experience hands-on in the operation, which is how do these things function? Because replacing old legacy systems, especially ones that aren't particularly well documented, and the ones that people don't really understand how they've developed or have organically ended up in these complex integrations, the only way to overcome that is by having an absolute deep understanding of how the operation actually works, so that you can actually process map it yourself and in essence re-engineer it. And I think that task is daunting for a lot of people, because it sounds incredibly complex. The way I always describe it is it's like a Lego model. Like if you look at the Starship Enterprise or the Millennium Falcon, actually, if you look at that as a Lego model, you think this is insanely complex. But the reality is it's just made up of about 1,000 more tiny pieces. Each one is really simple. And if you can get to that level of detail, you can then actually unwind and unpick how some of these old systems were designed and how they work, and then think through how to, in essence, strangle and replace them with modern replacements.
Amazing.
So those of our viewers and listeners that want to know more, whether they are interested in terms of being curious, or they want to come and provide some of that ops experience, maybe work with you, co-collab, or even invest, where can they find out more information from?
So the brand is Opfix. So I'm www.opfix.com, OPFYX. For those curious as to why the name is the name, so it obviously is a play on the word op and fix, but the FYX was actually in my head the mathematical notation for function with the two variables y and x. So that is the background behind the name. But you can find me on there, on LinkedIn, or at ben@opfix.com.
Amazing. Well, look, we're going to move on to our very revered segment, which is our quick fire round. So we're going to give you a couple of minutes to prep, and we'll get some of the questions. So we're going to start off with a few short questions. The usual, I hope you've seen it, but simple questions, and then we'll go on to a bit more detail on those questions, and then we'll look to end.
Perfect.
Amazing. So
I haven't actually seen the questions.
no, you haven't. No, I don't show them anyway. It's supposed to be a surprise. So, well, we've done enough now that we have a lot of question banks. There's a couple of people who have messaged on LinkedIn to maybe ask certain questions to certain.
I see.
So look out for those. Okay, here we go. Chicken or beef?
Chicken.
Aisle or window?
Window.
Favorite aircraft type?
747.
Favorite airport?
Changi.
One travel essential that you can't live without?
That's a good one. iPad.
Real. People have gone headphones. Well, someone strangely said deodorant, but iPads joins the list.
iPad, yeah.
Dream destination you haven't travelled to yet?
Haven't Seychelles.
Earliest aviation memory? I think you built on that before.
But yeah, for sure, 747 flight deck visit on a Malaysian Airlines plane in the 90s.
Things that inspire you most about the aviation and travel industry?
Still fascinated by the fact that we can get an aircraft flying at 38,000 feet for 13 hours and get across the globe. I mean, it's just, that inspires me more than the ability for us to do that.
Okay. Now looking to the future of aviation. Electric planes or supersonic travel?
Electric planes.
One innovation, apart from Opfix, that you think will change the air travel industry in the next few years?
That's a really good question. I would say sustainable fuels and advancements in making aviation more sustainable. So whether that's electric or increased production of SAF in order to decarbonize the industry.
one thing that you would tell your younger self?
Go with the flow.
Amazing. That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
That's our quick fire round. You did amazing. Ben, it has been an absolute pleasure. Even I learned more than I knew before, and it was such a unique thing. I mean, this is why I love having Sahel. So make sure you stick around for more episodes. It is just the connection that you can give of the different interactions you've had, and share those stories and those life experiences. It really brings it to life. But thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure, and we love to have you here. We hope to have you back once you've launched Opfix and once you've got your first integrations going. This is always going to be open to you as a platform, by all means, and let's have those detailed discussions in the future.
Thank you very much, for sure. I've enjoyed it as well. And see you soon.
Amazing. Again, if anyone wants to get in touch with Ben, his details will be in the description, a link to his LinkedIn and the website as well. But thank you so much again for the support, and we hope to see you on the next episode.